There we go.
Thank you.
All right. Fantastic. Okay. So, kia ora koutou katoa. Nathan Surendran aho. I'm a, as Jack says, recovering professional engineer. The current chairperson of the Wise Response Society. For the last, I guess, 15 years or so that I've been in New Zealand, a primary focus of mine has been communicating what I think I understand about the current crisis. And what I mean by that is that if you take a view of what's going on from a physics and energy resource depletion perspective, which I'll walk us through this evening, then it's entirely predictable that we are where we are, and it implies certain constraints on what's possible going forward. So that's the basis sort of framework that this talk sits within. And as Jack mentioned, the Wise Response Society that I'm chairperson of it's a coalition of lots of different people from right across society. And our primary question, which we ask, is: as demand for growth exceeds Earth's physical limits, causing unprecedented risks, what knowledge and actions do we need to secure New Zealand's future well-being? In that context, we are being busy over the last, we've made lots of submissions over the last 15 years to government on various things, and done a lot of thinking in the background, a lot of discussion over the last year as we could see this crisis building about how do we actually communicate. And as a result of those discussions, we were able to put out some documents, one called When the Trucks Stop, which is a guide to mutual aid, which has been very well received in the context of the fuel crisis. And then I put out another one fairly recently called No Fuel Still Fed. There's links to all of this in this presentation document, which will be linked to in the... do you want to just drop that link into the chat for people, Jack, at the end maybe? Or I'll do it if I remember. And the new No Fuel Still Fed document is really a, I guess you'd say, white paper where I'm trying to help people to engage the thinking of their local authorities, because it's fairly clear that there's some ideological inertia, shall we say, at the national level when it comes to a sensible response. And so we are kind of left to deal with this somewhat at the local level. And that's kind of, again, also not entirely surprising. One of the features of energy descent is the functional unit around which you can plan and organize and so on becomes smaller as our mobility is constrained. And that's something I'll touch on in this presentation as well. So anyway, onwards. So here's a question to start this off, and just type yes in the chat to these two questions. I'll ask the first one. So just a Y or an N in the chat. Who's already had a preparedness conversation with a neighbor this year? And this is just for me to get a bit of a read of the room, and also we'll use this a bit later. Another question that I ask a bit later. So that's quite a few people saying yes, I think. I just have to jump over to the chat, apologies, to see, yeah, that's good, yeah. A few no's in there as well, and I totally understand that. It's something that I've struggled with. I did actually finally send a group chat message to the people on my street, and we have a Christmas party that we have annually, and so we have a group chat, and I sent them some links and said, look, are people interested in actually, getting together and having a bit of a chat about this? And you got one sort of equivocal response. It's hard. People don't necessarily understand the urgency, and that's what this is about as well. But who thinks who's here because they think we're in for a rough ride is my second question. And again, same thing. If people can just type yes or no in the chat in answer to response to that. And again, yes, quite a few people are getting that this is not your average garden variety crisis. This is not COVID. This is not the GFC. This is not the 1970s fuel crises. This is considerably bigger than all of those. There's no real historical precedent for it. And it's important to to just be aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to start with a controversial statement in the context of the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, and I did have someone reached out to me and said, "I think you've got this wrong." And I want to say I don't think that New Zealand will probably hit its climate targets because of policy. Clearly, it's clear that the policy settings are wrong. Emissions keep going up, and that is a problem. However, because the economy is set to contract as fuel supply prices increase and upcoming shortages bite, when you can't afford to burn fuel, you don't burn fuel. Where's that going? Oh, there we go. So another question that's probably quite controversial, which is, economic contraction, designed or chaotic? Now, Jack and I have both been involved with several others in growing that degrowth out of our own network. Sarah Crease has been spearheading those efforts very capably over the last few years. And really the degrowth conversation is not to say we want to degrow the economy. There's lots of material comforts that come from growth, and it's reasonable to acknowledge that. However, the reality of the situation is that there is an economic contraction coming for reasons that I will go into in a minute. And the question that the degrowth proposition asks is really, is this a designed contraction with fair rationing, demand reduction, essential services protected, and community buffers built, hopefully in advance? Or is this a chaotic contraction, some level of collapse where we have queues, hoarding, price spikes, rationing by price? You've heard that. Wealth decides who gets fuel, essential services scramble, and a mistrust and blame cascade. So why do we think that this is inevitably a economic contraction? So let's start with the fuel picture. We have the Strait of Hormuz closed. Everyone's heard now, both oil and LNG supply globally is down by about 20%. It's actually about 40% of traded global oil supply. The refineries are damaged. The French government assessed about a month ago and said 30 to 40% of the refinery infrastructure, the export terminals, etc., had sustained some level of damage. And their best estimate, based on that level of destruction at that point, just around the time of the ceasefire, was around a 3-year period to restore it. Fatih Birol, the chief economist at the IEA, is on the record in the last few days saying, the oil system is not going back to where it was. We will never get back to those levels of production. New Zealand imports 100% of its refined fuel, primarily from Singapore and South Korea, and their crude suppliers like Kuwait, again in the last few days, are declaring force majeure. We have roughly 3 weeks of diesel physically onshore, and the commercial system, which is to say insolvencies as fuel price spikes turn profit margins negative, plus household financial stress and mortgage delinquency growing, breaks before the physical supply does, it looks like. That is to say, the financial system, the commercial system, has a faster response time. Just a quick word on force majeure. It's a Latin term. It basically means we can't deliver and we're not liable. Act of God. This was unforeseeable, and so suppliers walk away from contracts. Shipping insurance withdraws cover. Buyers scramble to secure supply in the spot markets, which cause price spikes and price volatility that we're seeing with the US president flip-flopping on his, position on a almost daily basis, and then cascades through every link of the supply chain. So the crude supply, the refining capacity, shipping, ships in the wrong place. It's all very carefully scheduled normally, and this disruption has just wrecked all of that, similar to what COVID did, but worse again. Distribution is then under stress, and we know in New Zealand that the distributors, as they did in Australia a little bit before our guys started doing it, are actually having to ration. I've had multiple reports from various farming sources saying that bulk fuel supply to farms is very challenging at the moment, and obviously we have the retail price spikes. Not so much retail outlet shortages yet, but we believe that's coming. And why we believe that's coming is that the 60-day pipeline is running dry. That's to say, about 60 days ago, crude was still leaving the Middle East at the start of this conflict. It got out of the Strait of Hormuz and travels at about the speed of a bicycle. So, 15, 20 kilometers an hour. It's not very fast. And so it takes a long time for that to get from the Strait of Hormuz to Singapore, even longer to get to South Korea and the other refineries. And that process is only really now drawing to an end. So the last of that pre-conflict crude has been arriving in Asia over the last week or two. And Asian refineries that supply New Zealand have been drawing down crude that left the Gulf before the conflict, both in terms of tankers traveling to their destination port and refinery, and then also they have some onshore buffers of crude as well. But the next tanker is not behind these. So this is a long arc. It's not a sudden event. And this is one of the things that makes it a little bit difficult for people to get their head around. Declining net energy, which is what we have globally. That is to say, we've extracted all the good stuff first because, low-hanging fruit, it's more profitable. That's where we go for it. Every barrel now that we bring into the market costs more energy to extract than the last. And it's the energy that's the important part here, because with less net energy, net of the cost of production, what you then have is all the elective things that we do with the surplus from our energy system, healthcare, education, literally everything in the industrial society, actually becomes squeezed. So there's commercial pressure grows, margins are squeezed, buyers competing for fewer high quality sources. And there's been this ongoing conversation over the last 15, 20 years around productivity globally, and why isn't productivity growing? And, we must be doing something wrong. And you hear it in New Zealand, you also hear it all over the world. And it's not because anyone's necessarily doing anything particularly wrong. I mean, we've had quite big advances in technology, which have improved some of the efficiencies in the system. And yet we still see this stagnation of productivity, and also a stagnation of debt productivity. It used to be that you borrow a couple of dollars and you get, a dollar back in GDP growth. Now it's sort of $8, $10 to get that same dollar of GDP growth in debt. And that is a problem, obviously, when it comes to repayment of that debt. And is the debt actually literally repayable? And as that commercial pressure builds and people start competing for those fewer high quality resources, then you start to see a rise in geopolitical tension. So states maneuvering to secure flows and alliances hardening around resources. That spills over inevitably into open conflict of the sort that we've got in the Strait of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf area in a general sense, with the I'm going to say insane Iraq attack on Iran, just to shortcut a whole lot of other things that I could say about it. But strikes on the refining capacity in particular are catastrophic over the long term. And insurance and shipping withdrew quite quickly. Sorry, it's insurance of shipping, so that should be withdrew quite quickly in that situation. And so now we are where we are. A real physical shortfall is starting to reach importing countries. And, we haven't yet absolutely seen, outright shortages that are, impacting everyone quite yet. I believe if you read, and, I've been looking at a lot of the commentary around this at the global level, there is a bottleneck. This is not a one-off geopolitical shock. And it's a long arc, and we've been outbidding our neighbours. So why we haven't seen supply shortfalls so far, we've secured supply in the commercial markets by paying more. Refined product markets are clear on price. A wealthy buyer with urgent demands wins against a poorer buyer. And because we have a relatively good credit rating and all those other things that allow us to secure supply, our Pacific neighbours are feeling it first, and our pump prices have jumped, but we haven't had outright shortages leading to forecourt queues. And as this continues, we're going to see that shift. So that price and pressure margin is going to lead ultimately to a politicization of what is thought and reported on and talked about by central government in New Zealand as a commercial situation, as outright shortages lead to the potential for outright civil unrest in countries, then we'll start to see the diplomatic side of things come to the fore. And I wrote an article last week about that, what that looks like from a supply chain perspective for New Zealand suppliers, looking at, well, I mean, they've been paying as well for now, but you know, when you understand a little bit about the sort of tradition in those countries around, you know, wanting to be seen as team players, New Zealand refusing basically to move even just up one phase to say we should be conserving fuel supplies, and you know, not mandatory fuel restrictions, but you know, pushing hard on the voluntary restriction pedal has not been happening here. And they'll look at us and they'll say, well, you know, you guys are not really team players in this regard. And I think that's a diplomatic risk when it comes to negotiating for a share of constrained resources as we move into that territory. All of the conflicts over time in the last sort of 20, 30 years, if you look a little bit under the surface, and you don't really have to scratch very far, you know, call it what you will, you know, diplomacy, democracy, protecting democracy, you know, counter-terrorism operations, self-defense, it's been called. The resource map, and specifically oil, is never far below the justifications that nation states use to escalate in this regard. There's also another problem, which is that it's not just oil that this affects. There's been because of the neoclassical economics that we've been using to try and understand what's going on, that doesn't really give us insight into the energy situation at all. I mean, you know, if you listen to economists who kind of get the resource side of things, you know, the economic system that we have doesn't even model banks as part of the models that are used to generate, you know, economic predictions and so on. You know, it's a very, very abstracted model, and it really fails in a situation where growth is constrained by energy supply constraints, which is what we're heading into. One of the things that does is it cascades through the economy, because that oil and the gas is used for lots of other things. So for example, urea is produced from Qatari natural gas, and you know, a significant percentage of global urea supply is now curtailed as a result of those that natural gas infrastructure having been damaged and in some cases destroyed, and then obviously also the choke point around the Strait of Hormuz. So even if the gas tankers were able to be filled, no one's going to insure a tanker that's moving through an active war zone, because those things are literal bombs, you know, carrying pressurized liquefied natural gas. Also, the Middle Eastern crude is what's known as sour crude. It has a lot of sulfur in it, and as that sour crude is processed at the refineries, a byproduct is a heck of a lot of sulfur, which is then used in processing rock phosphate into superphosphate and lots of other parts of the industrial supply chain, some copper production, etc. And also industrial feedstocks, you know, petrochemicals are used for copper, steel, plastics, pharmaceuticals. And as the supply chain tightens and we see price inflation as well as economic stagnation, then we get construction slowdown, spare parts start to dry up, our medical supply chains and pharmaceuticals tighten. So I want you to, in that context, think about one thing that your house would struggle to do without fuel for a week, and just write it down somewhere. You can drop it in the chat if you like, but we'll come back to this. I'll just give you 30 seconds to do that. Okay, so I mentioned before that I think the financial system is going to respond faster even than the supply system in this regard. And to contextualize that, we have to understand the situation in New Zealand. We have insolvencies already at a 15-year high before the conflict. The IoT tax debt passed $9 billion. Household debt is 165 to 170% of disposable income. Reports, for example, of 1/3 of New Zealand households reporting some level of food insecurity. There's a report that was released just before the conflict began. There is no buffer. And mortgage arrears in particular at ATO peak, and with diesel above $4 a litre, this flows through to obviously freight, food, fertiliser and farm input costs. But also, you know, when you think about the GFC analysis of that crisis, if you sort of take a biophysical economics perspective and look at energy flows and energy prices and the knock-on effects, about 18 months before the GFC really hit, there was a big price spike in the price of gasoline products, and I think crude barrel went up to about $120, $125, if I remember correctly, and that has a knock-on effect. So if you think of it like this, households have to three big expenditures: energy, primarily fuel, food, and often mortgage repayments. And in a situation where fuel price spikes and takes out a load of money that would otherwise be used for one of the other two, you can't really stop buying food, although some people do for a while, but it's literally unsustainable, right? So you have to stop paying your mortgage. And so that leads to this spike in mortgage arrears, and already at an 8-year peak, those arrears and the repayments slip and defaults follow. And everyone seems to be watching the wrong metric at the moment. We're watching those fuel gauge tracker, fuel supply trackers, and number of ships landing and all the rest of it. And it's kind of hard to see business failures and mortgage defaults because the statistics are very much a lagging indicator, and it can take months for that to really show up in the statistics. But I mean, just talking to people around me, I'm seeing a lot of a sense of that is what is practically going on at the moment. Businesses and households are feeling that price and pressure payments before fuel runs out at the pump. Sorry, that's a bit of a duplicate. So why is all this happening? Like, what's really going on here? You know, and I think I just want to bring us back to the fact that we have a finite planet. So the first principle is that our economy is a subsystem of the Earth's biosphere. It's not separate from it, and it is finite. Our only true ongoing energy income is from the sun. And as economist Steve Keen has said, labour without energy is a corpse, capital without energy is a sculpture. And as we draw down on energy, we have to sit with the reality that all economic activity is energy expenditure. That is to say, fossil fuel energy, particularly oil and specifically diesel, is the lifeblood of industrial society. It's a non-renewable, depleting resource, and its extraction and use is subject to diminishing returns, as I've already described briefly. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail now. So energy economics, the economy runs on energy, literally all of it. You know, you don't do anything, moving things around, you know, the sort of thing that generates GDP without energy. And we've been drawing down on this one-time inheritance of fossil fuels for 150 years. Renewables and electrification help, you know, from the installation base that we currently have, a big step up in rooftop solar and more widespread use of EVs is a strategy that gives us a bit more time for adaptation, potentially. It does have an ecological cost, and I'm not saying that we should be ignorant of that, but, you know, we need a little bit of time to transition. I believe that gives us that to some degree. However, you know, we are starting from a minute resource installed base, and the resource flows that are driven by fossil fuel supply that enable the production of these renewable energy systems and electrical machines that they could power is all challenged right now. And so less energy flowing through means less resource throughput, means the economy gets smaller. And that's not a doomer statement, that's just physics. We've seen over the last 200 years, really, since the start of the Industrial Revolution, that energy transitions are additive. That is to say, we use as much biomass today as in 1800, probably a bit more. We've added coal to that, then added oil, natural gas, hydros, nuclear, and then we're starting to try and, displace some of that with solar and wind. But Jevons paradox says, as you get these more efficient sources in some respects, then what happens is you get an increase in efficiency, which leads to increased profitability, which is taken by for-profit organizations as increased throughput. Excuse me, I don't have a glass of water. There we go. And so we have to challenge this ideology of endless growth. Our society is built on assumptions of perpetual growth, and a mere 3% annual growth means a doubling in consumption every 24 years. On a finite planet, the term sustainable growth is a mathematical impossibility, an oxymoron. And there's a link there to an entertaining little 1-minute video clip, which I won't play right now, that demonstrates that quite nicely. The 1972 Limits to Growth study predicted this trend that we've been on. And the graph, which I've actually dropped out of this presentation, apologies, closely shows how closely the real world has tracked their business as usual scenario. So for all of the bloviating about policy, really it hasn't made very much difference to the trajectory that we've been on, which is basically around this idea of growth. So when we think about growth, there's a really helpful little thing that you should learn, which is the rule of 70. A sustained percentage growth rate eventually leads to a doubling of whatever's growing. And to find out how quickly this will happen, a rule of thumb to help you think about this is to divide the percentage growth figure into 70. So, for example, looking about this in terms of oil demand, at 3.5% per annum global growth, as a 3.5% per annum global growth average historically, since we started using oil in the 1920s, we used about that much oil, just in graphical terms, think of the area. And that was up to, say, about the GFC. Since the GFC, in the 20 years since the GFC, we have consumed the same amount of oil as the entire period from the 1920s to the GFC, because we've been growing at around that same growth rate. It's dropped down a little bit, maybe, so that might be slightly out, but just to illustrate the principle. And again, if we were to continue that, if we were able to sustain that rate of growth, then in another 20 years, we'd consume another half again of double again what we'd consumed in that period up until this point. Why we're not going to do that is pretty straightforward, and it relates to this diagram, which it comes from geology. And basically, if you ignore the two dotted lines and so on, this is, you can think of as the total amount of resource that's available in the ground. The volume is fixed because it's finite, and as you go up that pyramid on the left-hand side, they have increasing resource quality. And as you go down the pyramid, the note next to it, it's decreasing in spatial concentration. It's more dispersed in the Earth's crust and not in convenient pools of light sweet crude like guar, for example. Guar's not quite light sweet, but like the 1920s hillbillies, where you could literally drive up, stick a straw in the ground, light sweet crude would bubble out, and you could drive away. That's the conventional resources that we think of. That's powered about 90% of world production to date, and it's a finite resource, and we have depleted the majority of that. And people point to the total proven resources and say, well, there's this there's still the same amount of oil in the ground as we've already extracted. And it's like, yes, there is. However, it's not the same sort of oil. And for the last 15, 20 years, most of the growth in all liquid supply has come from condensate and natural gas liquids out of the US fracking operations. Condensate and natural gas liquids are very light forms of oil. They're not the heavier crudes that we need to refine diesel and the other middle weight products that do a lot of the work in the economy, including jet fuel, kerosene, things like that. And so we are trying to draw down on these unconventional resources, but now concentrate on those two dotted lines. There is somewhere in here a price and technological limit, and I would say that the evidence around the productivity of the oil industry generally over the last 20 years or so suggests that we're somewhere near that limit. And what I'm saying is that we are actually rapidly approaching something closer to this energy in equals energy out limit. That is to say, the net energy, net of the cost of production, as I was talking about before, is declining rapidly. We can think of that energy profit in terms of Darwinian fitness. And so if the cheetah expends more energy chasing its prey than it gets from eating the prey, it will eventually starve. And similarly, if the global economy expends more energy extracting energy than it gets from the extraction of that energy, it will eventually starve. This is another way to look at that same point. Sorry to labor it, but it is a very important point. It's pivotal to understanding this. Sorry. This chart shows what's typically known as the Hubbard curve, that upper bell-shaped distribution curve. The area below that curve is the total amount of resource that's available. You can think of the gross energy rate, which is one that's reported on, the 100 million barrels a day that's given. And what we need to focus on is this net energy delivery rate. So you can look at this a number of different ways. One economist, Tim Morgan, talks about how the amount of GDP that's put into the energy sector is growing annually in terms of percentage. And that's a reflection of the requirement to put more in as an energy subsidy to get energy back out. And as you subsidize that production, your net energy declines precipitously after a while, and particularly after that peak global supply point, which is where we are roundabout, and falls off a cliff on the other side. And so although there may be, the same amount of oil in the ground broadly, we've gone a bit past it, but, in broad terms, as we've extracted historically, the fact of the matter is that we're rapidly approaching this resource cutoff point where the energy in equals the energy out. So that's to say, we have to put as much energy in as we get back. So the net energy, net of the cost of production, drops to zero. So all the things that aren't the energy industry suddenly become impossible because you don't have any surplus energy to do them. What you might be thinking now. If this isn't right, If it was, there'd be more people talking about it. I can't believe I'm wasting my time listening to this crap. It makes me so angry. But technology and efficiency are solving these problems as they have in the past. Well, maybe we should all just drink the Kool-Aid and check out then. This sucks, but at least knowing the truth means we can plan realistically. It's kind of a spectrum of responses that I've heard over the years. I'd just like to point out that these are effectively the 5 stages of grief. You have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then you move to acceptance. And I'd like to say personally, I was made redundant just after the GFC in 2009 and actually had some time to stop and think and read. And I read Limits to Growth and Chris Martinson's Crash Course and came across some thinkers like Nate Hagens and Nicole Foss and a variety of others. They basically opened my eyes to this. And I went through a bit of a cycle over many years, actually, of denial, anger, bargaining, and depression. And, that place of acceptance is something where you've let go of a lot of the things that you thought were possible or that you thought were in your future when you thought that, oh, well, this is just something that's going to affect the next generation. Like, it's in the future. You have to really worry about that. I'm more worried about climate, for example, and a lot of people are in that position. And rightly so. I mean, climate risk is existential, but the idea that we can continue emitting at the rate that we have been historically and at the rate of growth that we have historically is simply false on the basis of what we've just discussed. So is there a better way? I mean, we can choose a glass half full perspective, right? A positive perspective on this, which is what we lose in material standards of living. And remember, the global average is a lot different to where we live and in New Zealand. And what we lose in terms of that material standards of living is made up for in renewed community, interdependence, spirituality, and slowing down just to be, I guess, mostly harmless human beings, not human doings. We're not just economic actors. There's a lot more to the human condition than that, right? I really like this quote from Vinay Gupta, which says, collapse is living in the same conditions as the people who grow your coffee. It's basically what we're talking about from a New Zealand perspective, right? And when I talk to people who visit these supposedly underdeveloped countries where they literally do grow our coffee, they come back and they say two things consistently. They're the poorest people I've ever met, and they're the happiest people I've ever met. So our economic paradigm needs to change. We've tried the triple bottom line model, balancing social, economic, and environmental economic perspectives. We end up with a Mickey Mouse version of the triple bottom line model, whereby economic priorities override social and environmental concerns, and we have to move to this biophysical understanding rooted in ecological economics, which recognizes that the economy is a subset of a functioning society, and a functioning society can only exist within an alive biosphere. This was one of my dad's favorite books, and I guess I subconsciously might have absorbed some of this, although he never really talked to me about it very much, unfortunately. But I came to it myself around the time that I read Limits to Growth and so on. And I highly recommend reading this book. There's a link down there. But small is beautiful. And, we should practice economics as if people mattered, and actually people and the planet mattered, the non-human species. And so what would a post-growth economics look like? We've had this growth metabolism mentality, the top row there, which is all about efficiency, extraction, accumulation, private ownership, and control. And we need to move to this post-growth metabolism for the economy. We're using words like sufficiency, regeneration, distribution, commons, and care as our guiding phrases. And I like Ted Trainer and his thinking around the simpler way and the guiding principles from that, which allow us to then reduce the economy or conceive of an economy that fits within the energy constraints as they will exist for us, because that isn't optional. Will be around smaller, simpler lifestyles, much less production and consumption, much less concern with luxury, affluence, possessions, and wealth. It will have to be smaller, highly self-sufficient local economies, largely independent of the global economy. And we need more cooperative and participatory ways, enabling people in smaller communities to take control of their own development, a new economy, and some very different values. No cooperation, especially cooperation, not competition, and frugality and self-sufficiency, not acquisitiveness and consuming. So what can we do? And this is where I'm going to sort of just talk through some of the things that are in those guides that I mentioned at the start, the When the Truck Stop guide to mutual aid, and that No Food, Still Fed sort of guide to what can be practically sort of pushed for at the regional level. Start where you have control and work outwards. So start with yourself, your household, your neighborhood, your community, and then, the regional and ultimately, theoretically, at least, national level. Although on the basis of my attempt at that level, I think it's better to focus on the stuff nearer to home. Those are links to the two guides. You and your household, let's start there. Know your dependencies. What do you actually need fuel for? Like what's non-negotiable? And remember, non-negotiable has to fit within what is actually going to be available to you. So start reworking your expectations. I don't think that we will be moving stuff around very much going forwards. That's both goods and people. We are going to, there's an economist called David Fleming who I've got a link to some of his work at the end. And he says localization stands at best at the limits of practical possibility, but it has the decisive argument in its favor that there will be no alternative. So what are the direct and indirect needs you have, and that word that you wrote down before, maybe start with that. Demand reduction. Negawatts are cheaper than any substitute. So insulation, heat pumps, shorter trips, combined trips. Food resilience, what you grow, what you store, what you can preserve. I'm not saying that is easy. Local food production is a tough nut to crack, and it is going to be the challenge of the next 20 years in many respects. Winter produces a short list, not a full menu. That is to say, we have to think seasonally about this, and we have to adjust our expectations around what we will eat going through winter and through in the cooler climates like where I live in Southland, what's known as historically as the hunger gap. And I'm again with the message that we should consider reducing our meat intake to a point for environmental reasons, but recognize that in temperate climates, in a resource constrained future, livestock, literally animals that grow, continue through the winter, they've got fat through the summer and autumn, and they are a resource that we can draw down on in terms of producing food for human consumption for parts of the year. And maybe we move to more of a seasonal relationship with animal products and that sort of thing, if that's a concern for you. I think it will be a constraint more than a concern, as I've been saying. But water, there's been lots of good discussion all over the place about, second water supplies for towns. The conversation in Invercargill is so boring. It's been going on for 20, 30 years, and they've basically exhausted all the insane things now, like piping water from Monowai or that sort of thing. The reality is that rainwater capture and storage from your rooftop is cheap. It's simple and it's useful in multiple scenarios. It builds resilience because it doesn't rely on a reticulated network. Christchurch could have done with that back in 2011. And skills like bike repair, food preservation, basic first aid, gardening, low cost, high leverage. 7 initiatives that could be helpful. Sorry, there's a bit of a rainstorm going on. I don't know if you can pick up that noise in the background. But so around food, farmer community agreements, and this is something in the No Food Still Fed guide, where I think territorial authorities, and particularly authorities in the same region across that urban-rural boundary, should be having a conversation in the background about how do we actually get the people together in society who can make these sorts of decisions. And you can, if you know a farmer, by all means go straight to them. But as a society and as a city, looking at the rural areas around it and saying, well, if those guys can't export those animals, maybe we can pay them. So as they destock in response to fuel and fertilizer shortfalls that they're seeing projected for the next growing season or two, then actually we can use those resources to provide food for human needs. CSAs and cooperative buying, urban and suburban growing, these are all things that are time-proven methods. The cooperative approach to funding local food production as a local food resilience initiative is something we should absolutely be pushing into as hard and as fast as we possibly can, and leveraging things like community kitchens and food hubs. It's fuel efficient to cook centrally like that, and maybe not every day of the week, but more communal meals could actually lead to an increase in connectivity as people will literally get together in the local area and share food and talk and go back to some of those, again, historic methods of communication, which as humans have led to the competitive advantage that's got us into this mess in the first place. Seed saving and exchange, another critical factor, and community food waste collection. I will say on food waste in a general sense, and the whole waste to energy thing, people say, oh, you can just run your diesel powered vehicle on chip fat oil. In a resource constrained future, one man's garbage is another man's gold, and there is no real fat in the system, and so there is no waste. Because if you waste food, you starve. So just something to bear in mind when you're talking about waste to energy and that sort of stuff. It's only the surplus energy that we have that's driven the excess that leads to the food wastage on the scale that we see it in the modern society. As I mentioned before, rainwater at household scale is a really good way. A couple of IBCs and some connection hardware, downpipe diverters and a bit of pipe to put it into the IBCs. Target maybe 2 to 4 cubic meters as a minimum per household. You just clad the outside of the IBC in some ply to keep the sunlight out of it. Put a first flush diverter in. There's a guide called To Catch the Rain by a guy called Lonnie Grafman, who's the one of the co-founders of the Apropedia site. And in that no fuel still fed guide, and I think in When the Trucks Stop as well, I've got links to his resource, which allows you to size and calculate and size rainwater systems properly. And obviously for drinking, if it's a clean metal roof, it's generally quite safe. A lot of people rurally live on tank water that comes off the roof without much in the way of filtration. You do need to ideally boil or put some bleach in there to be confident that it's safe if you don't have filtration on it. And there are also gravel, sand, charcoal filters, which are a lower tech filtration system that you can build yourselves. And I put out a guide, which again is linked to in those other documents. Obviously, if you then feel that the water is not still, the right taste, you can polish it with one of those ceramic filters, like the Brita ones. I'm going to go through these three quite quickly because I think we're getting to the end of time and I'm conscious of wanting to give some questions. So, across energy, transport and health, there are a variety of other things that can be done. A couple of things I'll pick on here. Animal traction. I put this in really as a bit of a provocation to people. The reality is that training bollocks takes time, takes traditional knowledge. We do still have elders in our society and people who've kept those traditions alive. I'm not saying that that's going to be the answer and that we all need to do it, but for niche applications and for certain farming systems, they will be very useful. We have a whole load of bobby calves about to be born this season, and Frisians make passable draft animals, apparently. What else will I point to in there? No, I think I'll just move on. You can come back and look at this. At the neighbourhood level, skills and tools inventory. That When the Truck Stop guide has lots of suggestions. It's across 10 areas. Download it. By all means, comment on it as well. There's an online version that's linked to, which you can add your comments to. Walk through it with your neighbours. The reality is that structure beats improvisation. And think about comms. Comms is a really important one. What happens if the networks go down? Most parts of New Zealand in the last few years have faced some level of state of emergency and some sort of disruption to comms. It's pretty inconvenient, and have a strategy in place. Have thought that through. One concrete ask for this month, I would ask you to organise one street or apartment block conversation. As I said, I've been attempting to do it myself with limited success so far, but I will keep plugging away at it. Economic mutual aid is also worth noting in the No Fuel Still Fed guide, which talks about what can be done at the community level. I talk about the potential to issue a script currency with demurrage, which is basically it drops in value over time, which encourages you to spend it and keep the velocity of money up. Let's keep that money flowing within the local area. It could be done by local councils. The councils have the asset base to back that sort of thing. It's probably not going to be necessary, hopefully, if the existing financial system continues with a basic level of function in the face of some pretty big spikes, as I've been saying, in terms of defaults and so on that we can see on the horizon and insolvencies. But we should educate ourselves a little bit about what some of those alternatives are. And then obviously things like time banking and lending circles or savings pools. I've put a link down the bottom here to the Living Economies website. There's some good information there about all those if they're unfamiliar terms to you. I'd encourage you to think about that and think about alternative economic arrangements, both with and without monetary tokens of some form or another. At the community level, Where does your council stand on fuel continuity? What's been formally assessed? Public forum questions are a legitimate lever. I've been to both the Southend District Council and the Invercargill City Council in the last week and given presentations. And on my Energy and Resilience Substack, you can find summaries of those presentations with links to the video recordings and so on, and also template letters based on mine that you can take and do what you will with in terms of modifying them to your own local situation. But I really encourage you, get in their faces, ask hard questions. They're supposed to be the leaders in our communities in some respects. Lead. That's the ask. The local body election candidates. I don't know why I said local body elections in October there. That's wrong, isn't it? It's the national. Sorry, that should be national. And it's November. Anyway, sorry. Typo aside. Energy and resilience are fair questions for every candidate showing up for, election as an MP, and show up to debates and ask them and push them on these things again as we get into that season. Local food networks, again, in the letters, there's questions around that, and particularly around that relationship and facilitating conversations, at least, that the councils can do between the various parties. And as I say, I've got template letters available for you there. There are some things about national strategic policy change. As I say, I'm less enthusiastic about these given the current ideological stalling, but we have put some work out as Wise Response and also previously through the Degrowth Aotearoa network about tradable energy quotas. You can find more information on the Wise Response Substack and the degrowth.nz website on that. 3 things you could do this week. Read one of those pieces that I've linked to, the No Fuel Still Fed or When the Truck Stop one, or one of the council interactions I've had. Have one conversation with a neighbour, a family or member or a colleague, and start with that word you wrote down earlier maybe, and write to someone in power, your council ideally, MPs, candidates, etc. I've put some templates out there, and they need to hear from multiple people about this. And then thinking for the month ahead, given that things are moving, there's some things to consider there. I'll leave you with this thought. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. And on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. There's a bunch of further resources, which I'm not going to go through. That's just to say there's a whole load of links there to other things that you can read. I'll pass over to Jack for a Q&A session.
That's great, Nathan. Thank you very much. I'd just like to point, before we get into the Q&A, I'd just like to point out to everyone that Nathan's slides will be on the Our Climate Declaration website. And I suspect, Nathan, they'll also go on the Wise Response Society website.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
well. Hey?
I've actually just dropped the link in the chat as well for anyone who wants to pick it up from there.
Yeah, well, we want to bring people to the websites too, because there's lots of other good information there that
There is, yeah.
background information.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, what I would suggest, folks, is that if you have a question or like to make a comment or contribute to the discussion, to use the React, raise a hand little icon, and I'll try to call on people in order so that everyone has a chance to make a point or ask a question of Nathan. And while people are thinking about their questions, Nathan, just a small question. We've heard a lot about how much diesel and petrol and airplane fuel and so on is available from different sources. What would you regard as the most reliable source of information for keeping track of what's happening there?
Goodness, that's a tough question, actually. There are multiple sources that I'm relying on to kind of distill an aggregate picture. I think on Substack, the New Zealand Energy blog, Larry does a reasonable job of putting good information out that's specific to New Zealand and summarising some of that. Where else would I suggest you go?
I suspect if there's a huge gap between what the official numbers are and what's
Yeah,
actually happening, that
yeah.
that you're
So
likely to say something about it at some point.
yeah. I mean, that's right. So I mean, my energy and resilience Substack as well. The some of the trackers that are out there are helpful. You know, there's been a number of people have put those together. There's one in particular that I like, which um, I'll grab the link to and email it through to you, Jack, and we can put that up on the websites as well. Which gives sort of scenarios so you can look at the what ifs kind of thing. What that um, does though is it does lead you into that trap, as I said in this presentation. You know, it's not so much about exactly like how many ships are coming and how many days have we got left and will the government do anything. I think pretty clear the government isn't going to do very much at this point, right? And actually what the point of this presentation is this isn't just a short-term crisis, this is long-term, and actually we need to make some fundamental changes to what we think about the future, what we expect from it, and how we act to meet that future well, irregardless of how many days of fuel are left. And I hope this presentation has left people with some sense of urgency and then also some clear actions and things that they can do.
Indeed. So, questions, comments? I don't see any hands up yet. Am I missing something?
Let's have a look at the participants list. Does that show any hands up?
Yeah, Helen's got her hand up. Go ahead, Helen.
And Catherine as well.
Unmute yourself. And nice to see you. Haven't seen you in a long time.
Oh yeah, hi Jack. Hi Nathan. Thanks so much for your
Hi,
talk. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. I put my question in the chat, but I'll just rephrase it. You spoke of financial contraction and some future economic woes, and I'm just wondering if you can speak more to how that might affect us locally in Aotearoa, what we might see, at what level.
Yeah, it's a good question. It is a little bit hard to unpick. I'm not really an expert in financial system dynamics to the level that I would have to be to really properly answer that question. What I can say is that from my perspective, just anecdotally and also reading in the mainstream media reports, growing numbers of reports around, trucking companies saying that they are literally going bust because of the price of fuel. I mean, that is an immediate red flag to me around food supply, right? Because if the trucking companies aren't moving food around, then it's not arriving in the supermarkets. So, those sorts of things, and particularly companies like that are quite exposed because they're on fixed term contracts often, and they don't necessarily have a clause in their contract which allows them to put a fuel surcharge on that's commensurate with the scale of the escalation in fuel prices that we've seen. So I think that's a really key thing that we've got to watch for is, there is a point, not just where trucking companies are going bust because of the fuel supply, but also, the fuel price spike, but also, as I said, there's this bottleneck coming in terms of the refiners and their capacity to actually supply fuel at whatever price you want to think about it, which will lead to outright shortages and the need for essential allocation to be clearly stated by central government, and that to be then pushed through and forced upon the rest of society, because we have to maintain food supply for human consumption primarily, in that situation. And this may go on for a number of weeks or months as a minimum, depending on how far things escalate from here. And things are not looking good in that respect. So, there are some quite serious considerations there. And I think, that food supply thing is the thing that I guess is keeping me awake at night.
Yeah, perhaps another comment just to add to that is the less you have to rely on money for exchanging what you need, like food, the better off you're going to be. So find ways of getting what you need that you can exchange with people. That's the whole point of the support network. Catherine, go ahead.
Hey, it's Lyndon, Jack. Hey, look, thank you, Nathan.
Lyndon,
That
hi
was
there.
really, really very on the money, I think, if we can put it that way. We're in Taranaki. We've got some positives and some negatives happening. Locally, we're kind of ticking most of the boxes that you suggest or trying to.
Yeah.
And as has happened through New Zealand's or Aotearoa's history, the Maori marae are leading the way again in terms of local food production, which is which is what they do, and which is where we're trying to work together, despite the present government's attempts at splitting us apart. On the negative, of course, as you well know, and probably everyone here knows, the government seems to be intent on putting an LNG terminal here, which, given the current state of the world, seems to be absolute madness. But I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on, future energy security for the country. Thank you.
Yeah. I think the reality that we have to face, and kind of the point of my presentation in some respects, is that we don't have an energy secure future. We haven't planned and done the things over decades, because it takes decades to allow us to say we would have a secure future. We are going to be constrained probably more than other developed nations because of our physical remoteness and our size relative to those other nations. And there are some very hard times ahead. And I can't sugarcoat that. I think in terms of things we can do, the electrification thing, to me, although it's problematic in some respects, particularly when people just blithely talk about it as, we're transitioning to a renewable energy society and we'll keep going at the current scale. I mean, that's clearly insane, right? It's just nonsense, and it isn't going to happen just purely on the basis of the amount that's already installed and how much would need to happen. Having said that, if the government were to take that $1.5 billion or whatever the hell it is that they're going to spend on this LNG terminal and go to China and say, okay, we've got $1.5 billion New Zealand dollars. How many solar panels, inverters, and battery systems can we buy for that? And say, okay, we'll install these on the roofs of the poorest 5% of New Zealand households. And I did the calculation a few weeks back, and $1.5 billion would install solar and batteries on roughly the poorest 5% of households in New Zealand. That would make a difference. It would make a material difference. It would alleviate energy hardship in those households, because they'd have money that they're currently paying, often in poorly insulated houses, significantly more than the average for their weekly electricity bills, etc. And this is a potential way that the government could better spend that money on something that could have a material benefit. And also by buying in bulk, and I think this is one of the other things that people aren't getting, one of the things about our energy system that hasn't been done, and that infrastructure in a general sense, is you have to think in terms of triage of the existing systems at this point. And what that means over time is those systems will degrade, and we need to be able to sustain them for as long as possible. And if you have a whole lot of consistent componentry across 5% of households, then suddenly you've got a whole lot of interoperability. You can buy spare parts in bulk. You can, as society reconfigures itself around this new energy reality, potentially reconfigure those systems and move them into rural areas as people move back to, rural areas, because that's where the food supply is. And I think that's another interesting point. There's a book by Jason Bradford called The Future is Rural, which argues for that very convincingly in my mind. And I think, ultimately, like I said in the presentation, the fuel that's available to us is sunlight, and that will be, that was traditionally biomass. We'll have the ability to convert some of that into electrons for a period of time. But, the the announcement this week that Maui is on its last legs and will be decommissioned, should just put the nail in the coffin of the idea that we have a secure energy future. We clearly don't, and there are no silver bullets here.
Thank you.
Okay. Paul Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, just on the transport of freight, essential goods by freighting companies. We understand that 90% of the freight is on trucks. It's very tempting for the government, I think, to subsidise trucking firms so they don't go bankrupt. However, the real option is rail. And how do you think we can get the government to consider supporting rail rather than subsidising further the trucking companies? That's question one. But the other thing is our the availability of fertiliser. As you pointed out, urea is going to be quite short supply. However, there's been it's quite clear that a couple of 100 years ago we all used animal and human waste to fertilise our market gardens and whatever. So I haven't done the calculations, but in New Zealand, how difficult it would be to transition to a system based on recycling both human and animal waste efficiently, of course. But places like India and rural Indians probably just still use animal waste in particular, but sometimes human waste at all. And I was part of a Ministry of Environment working group that looked at the safety of recycling organic compounds, and that they ended up by writing a document which said you had to wait for 2 years with human waste. However, the European Community says only 1 year. And if you use,
so Paul, I think on your first question, there's a question that you refer back to my comments on energy transitions and the time it takes realistically to do these things. We have an existing rail network. It's limited in its connectivity, but it does connect the major urban centres. We have supposedly some rail-enabled ferries being procured again. The reality of that is that I think, again, if the government were to stump up some capital through sovereign money creation, MMT type stuff, and actually use that to, again, go to China and buy some battery electric locomotives and figure out how far they can go between charges and invest in some grid exit points where it's needed to boost those things up and keep them moving, then there would be a way to use the existing rail network as it currently stands with just the import of some rolling stock, not rolling stock even, some battery electric locomotives. It may be that could theoretically replace 5-10% of truck freight movements. I don't think it's going to realistically be more than that, because there's very limited amounts of rail and there's not that much in the way of places where trains can get past each other and all those good sorts of things that you need to happen. So we are very constrained, and the timescales involved to do something realistic on that are timescales that aren't really relevant to the immediate crisis. On your second question, I absolutely support that, and I think it should be done at the local level, actually at the household level. We use a composting toilet system, a bucket system, where we can, and that goes into a compost pile. We're lucky to have space to do that here in Invercargill. I recognise that many people living in larger cities don't have that space and don't have that luxury. And, the whole night soil collection that was historically the way that this was done may become a thing again. I mean, it's entirely possible that nutrient shouldn't be flushed down the toilet with drinkable water and, along with a whole load of other nasty chemicals from dishwashing soap and all the rest of it, and then put into our waterways. I think that would be a good idea to get away from that system. And I think it starts at the local level, and absolutely, it's again something that we can lobby for people to communicate so that people have a broad awareness of the potential of that. But simple local household scale, street scale systems, I think, are things that can be done at a timescale relevant to what we currently have to deal with in terms of this crisis.
Yeah, just may I add a comment about transport. We can talk about different means of transport, but I think the big issue we need to think about is how do we relocalize to minimize the need for transporting goods and people in the first place.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Joanna, go ahead.
Sorry, Joanna, you're muted.
You're muted, Joe.
Sorry. I want to join the chorus saying, Nathan, thanks for your heroic work in the last couple of months.
Thank you.
And my question has to do with this matter. The adaptation that the series of multiple adaptations that you've just outlined will be forced. I mean, we have to.
Oh, you're
muted
yourself.
Joe. You're muted again somehow.
Okay, I don't know.
Perfect.
There you go.
I don't know
Yeah.
where the muting took place.
Okay.
I was just saying.
Oh, you're just muted again.
What's going on there?
This is very
Come
weird.
sit next to me here if you need to.
Well, let me try once more.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And apologies to everyone. So forced adaptation now under these circumstances.
Yes.
Lots of the 80 odd people on this screen are involved in climate work.
Yes.
And we'll be realizing that these are the same adaptations that we need to make to the ecological overshoot crisis, or the climate crisis. What I think that lots of ordinary people, once they become aware of the adaptations that are needed, will think about them as temporary. We have to do this now, but let's get back to where we were, and how long is it going to last? One problem I think we face is trying to convey that no, these need to be permanent adaptations. Also, it seems to me that the oil companies will do their level best to resume production as soon as they can. I mean, we've heard in the last day or so that one of the Gulf states has exited from OPEC, so they won't have any constraints on their production.
Yes.
What are the possibilities that the forcing by constrained supply will lessen and make the job of permanent adaptation harder?
So when I think about this in terms of food systems, it's been pretty clear to me for a while now that the existing export-focused food system that exists in New Zealand has a momentum and generates weather all of its own that is kind of unassailable in the existing paradigm and with the existing economy. The reality of how fast that will change as that economy breaks is an open question. And I think regardless of how fast it breaks, what we need to be aiming for is a secondary system, which is a second economy, if you like, that sits alongside the first and is this local resilience, local food systems, local currencies potentially, as things, as the financial system stops serving people's needs and so on. I really don't know is the honest answer to your question. It's a very good question, and I'll take some time to think about it. But I don't I don't necessarily have a very clear sense of how that's going to play out.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
To be continued for sure. Thomas, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Thank you, Nathan, very much again for your dialogue. Fantastic. Just a few sort of hopeful comments in a way, perhaps. In the narrative of my parents, who lived through the Great Depression and through the Second World War in Germany in particular, the stories of surviving situations where resources were heavily constrained, where bombs were falling left and right, and so forth. Those stories of survival and how people made up with the systems that you pointed out of community, local production as well as give me hope that this will snap into being. We're capable of doing what my parents' generation did under terrible circumstances as well. So the other hopeful point is that we are having 95% of our dairy production is powderized terribly with the help of 750,000 tons of coal every year, and then shipped to China in bags. If food production in New Zealand was any issue for our own needs. I think there is ample land available to produce food, perhaps not immediately, but certainly on a short to medium time. So we're an underpopulated country. We can feed ourselves easily. So I'm hopeful we make this work.
Yeah, another helpful data point in that regard, something I hadn't fully appreciated, is how much seed is produced in New Zealand for export, which again is a resource which we can then rely on in terms of actually planting it here and growing some stuff. So I think that's very helpful. On your first point, that was why I had that slide in there about the poorest people you've ever met are the happiest people you've ever met. And I would just also note that the progress narrative, which is this dominant sort of mind worm that constrains our thinking, effectively says that we are evolving towards some flying cars and trips to Mars future, and the reality is that in evolutionary terms, this is a blink of an eye, this last 200 years, and there is nothing evolutionarily that is different from where the human species was 200 years ago, really. And actually, in that regard, as you say, I think it's often in a group like this, it's a lot of intellectualizing of these ideas and so on, and not recognizing that actually, I mean, there's an honest question mark in my mind about whether intelligence and the ability to think rationally about these things is actually an adaptive trait in many respects. Because as we go through these downturns, actually what needs to happen is pick a target and just execute. And that's what gets us through these times. And, the stories from your parents, my grandparents' generation, like they were very much about I got on my bike. This was literally my grandfather during the Second World War. I got on my bike every day and cycled over the North Yorkshire moors from Harrogate or Leeds to Sheffield to adjust drives on the machinery that was making the nose cones for the bombers or whatever, and I cycled back every day, and sometimes I was lucky and I caught the bus that would go on that route and I could draft behind the bus for parts of the route. It's just hard slog, and it's just repeat it day after day after day, and that's what gets humans through.
And another comment on transport, perhaps, when you look at the supermarket shelves at the moment and take away all the stuff we don't really need, we can probably transport our basic needs on a fraction of the transport capacity that we have. So if we have to live with 20% of the diesel fuel available, or 30%, say, for a while or for a longer time, we will make ends meet. We'll not starve to death, I'm sure. Personally.
Yeah, agree. Yeah.
Hey, we've got several other hands up here that if we can go through fairly quickly so that everyone has an opportunity. Go ahead, Catherine, unmute yourself.
Hi. It seems like there's a big push to electrification, which makes sense in terms of cleaner energy, but there are quite a few people that have pointed out that like solar panels and the big wind turbines and stuff use a lot of materials that rely on the creation of a lot of energy and a lot of systems around the world.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that if we are going to become dependent on those things that only potentially will last 30 to 50 years before they have to be replaced, is there any planning and process to make sure that things can be repaired in a degraded system, or are these simply interim, like a transition to a further transition?
I think they are literally that. A transition to a further transition is a reasonable way to frame it up. The reality of rebuildable technology, as Nate Hagen rebrands, renewable technologies, is that if we were to replace the current generation of fossil fuel powered machines with renewable energy powered machines, because they're accessing a more diffuse source of energy, the scale of the system will be something in the order of magnitude bigger. The materials for that simply don't exist, and not in an economic to extract form, and particularly given the constraints around energy that we've discussed tonight. So I'm a proponent for rapid electrification as far as we can push it. I don't think it'll be very far, which is why I'm not kind of sanguine about it from, an ecological impact point of view. What it does do, particularly if we were to do something like I described before, about 5% of the poorest households all get rooftop solar and batteries, is it gives you a distributed energy base, which is nothing like a replacement for the grid system and fossil fuels, but it gives us something that will soften the blow a bit as we go through this energy descent that is now upon us. So it's absolutely not that I discount the impact, the ecological impacts of the electrification of everything sort of narrative. It's just that I don't think it's possible beyond a certain amount, and we've got a narrow window now where we could do something positive, and that would make somewhat of a difference in terms of the impact of these broader energy constraints.
So are you aware of anybody who's working on, like, we used to make windmills out of wood and stone and things like that, looking at that?
There are groups. I know you may have heard the name Robert Guyton. He's a well-known environmentalist and permaculturalist. His son Adam was involved with a group somewhere up, I believe it was on the South Island, building traditional Dutch all-wooden windmills, for example. So there are people who have that knowledge in New Zealand. I don't know. I could probably find that out. But, yes, certainly there'll be a return to that. I love Low Tech Magazine, if you have come across that. He talks in Low Tech Magazine about direct mechanical transfer of energy, rope systems, pulley systems, and also those direct sort of water wheels, windmills, those sorts of things. And I think we will see a resurgence in those, hopefully with modern materials, because actually those could last for 200-300 years if they're designed properly, and so it's kind of not just harking back to what worked historically. It's recognizing that we're in a privileged position with our materials technology, and we could build things that were far more durable than the current system allows. Sorry, that's not too long, Jack.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to Richard. Give Richard an opportunity.
Yep.
Kia ora, Nathan. Thanks very much for the talk. Amazing work you're doing, and I entirely support the direction it's going and the need to build for an alternative economy and community structure while the other mainstream one gradually collapses around us. And many of your ideas kind of resonate back to the things that I was involved in the 1970s.
Absolutely.
Great collection of whole earth catalogues. But anyway, we won't reminisce too much about that. And subsequent movements like transition towns and so on. Littleton was a good example of that. But what I am interested in is the clash between idealism and political reality, and the way that people are currently behaving, particularly after some 3 to 4 decades of neoliberalism and excessive consumption, and the way that therefore people think. And as an indication to how people react to the situation, because we want people to react in a positive way, not in a competitive dog-eat-dog way. How has your presentations and work with the Southland Council gone? To what extent do you think you are actually making an impact? Because the great majority of the 95% of the population do not understand anything of what you've just been outlining, because they've never actually been told it.
I don't think they need to, and that's why I'm targeting the governance layer. It's the people in governance who can make the strategic decisions, and I think on the basis of the responses I've had, it's probably a small group, maybe a quarter to a third of councillors who have some hope of getting what I'm saying. We're lucky in Southland that the mayor is an engineer with a background in the energy industry, so he has a better chance than most of getting it, even though from a sort of his career experience possibly points him in a different direction, his lived experience, but pointing out that this is a turning point, it's an inflection point in our energy systems and our energy story. I think that there's probably conversations going on behind the scenes. Obviously I'm not privy to those. The presentations that I gave to council were well received. I got some good questions at Southern District Council, less so at Invercargill City Council, but I've had private communications with a few councillors saying, they are thinking about these things, and the presentation and the open letters that I put forward have had an impact on their thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would suggest, pushing councils as much as you can, but don't rely on them.
No,
you need to take action yourself.
Yeah, 100%.
Jane, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Oh.
We'll try to squeeze Jane and Philippa in before we close. Go ahead, Jane.
I'm in Taupo. It's a sort of a medium-sized town, and quite there's a demographic like New Zealand, really, with a lot of elderly people. When I think about the hard work it requires, I think I should have started 30 years or 30, a long time ago, to really put a lot of energy into community style gardening, for instance. I do a small amount here, and I was thinking about the Cuban situation after the Iron Curtain went down, and in simplistic terms, how they didn't compromise on health and education, and they dispersed professionals into the rural. They got bicycles from China, I believe. They did horse and plough. They had probably a better growing season than Invercargill or wherever you are, I'm sorry, and Taupo. How do you see those sorts of the bottom up meeting the top down? And you've probably been talking about that quite a lot, but I worry about the demographic. I worry about health. I worry about
I would say anybody with investments or money in pension funds that you can realize on now, go buy some bicycles. It'll be a much better investment long term. And really, like, anybody with the means to do so should be investing in physical assets that are relevant to this transition that's being foisted upon us by the actions of the US. Be really careful about what I say publicly about that, but those guys, and so really, I think if we could convince government to buy those solar panels instead of an LNG terminal, I think that'd be great. If someone in the local area sees the need and orders a container load of e-bikes from China, that could be a really positive thing for the community that receives them. There is a little bit of adaptation room there. I don't know how long we've got, really, and it depends on how far this escalates. I will say that a 20% reduction in oil supply is going to break things in the global supply chains, and the ability to manufacture these things that we could theoretically buy goes away for a period of time and potentially permanently as a result. So, now is the time, if you've got the resources and you think buying stuff is going to help, be selective in what you buy, make sure it's consistent with the sorts of things we've been talking about, but do it now.
Right. Philippa, you've got the last opportunity for this evening.
Kia ora, Nathan. Thank you. It's kind of a personal question, but I'm hoping it might be relevant to other people. So I'm dependent on a medication for living day to day.
Yes.
Would you be recommending that, say, people like me be having conversations with our doctors? Like, I've just got no idea.
That's a really tough question. So, Philippa, I mean, I'll be honest. I think that there is a good possibility of the breakdown of the pharmaceutical system that supplies medications in a general sense, and I don't want, again, to sugarcoat that. I mean, death is part of life, and live the time that you have to the best of your ability. Do whatever makes sense to you in terms of providing for others and leaving a legacy, and just be a good human with whatever time we have. Tomorrow is not promised to any of us, right? And so really just encourage you to think about it in those terms. And there are lots of resources out there around living well and also dying well, and I think that all of us should be conscious of the fact that tomorrow is not promised, and that we should really have a different relationship as a society with the idea of dying. It's not the end of everything, although it is the end of your material form on this earth. I don't believe that's where things stop. So yeah.
In the meantime, though, you might look into herbal and natural remedies. There are many, and again, Maori have a long tradition of natural remedies.
Yeah.
Okay, that's been a fantastic evening, Nathan. Thank you very much. You've covered really critical information that everyone needs to know about. You've emphasized the importance of talking to people about these things, because we need each other to take action on these things. You've emphasized, I think the biggest takeaway for me is the old Boy Scout motto, be prepared.
Absolutely.
And you have to do it with other people, and have fun doing it in the meantime.
That's right.
So thanks one and all, and stay tuned for the additional webinars that we'll be bringing to you, dealing with these issues and struggling with these challenges that we all face. Thanks for your help and attendance, and Godspeed.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, Jack, and then can you grab the chat, please?
That's great. Yep, thanks.
Can you grab the